So what have you?
Dr. Robert Romanyshyn, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. Well, I feel very honored to meet you. I think I've heard your name over the years, and I know you're in the Jungian world, which is one that I like to dip my toe into every now and then.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to have an opportunity to discuss your latest book, which is titled Victor Frankenstein, The Monster and the Shadows of Technology, the Frankenstein Prophecies. Sounds very dramatic, I must say. And I'm especially interested in your topic because I've been a lifelong lover of technology, except that in recent years, I've become more and more alarmed by its dark underbelly, or should I say our dark underbelly. And so how did you come to write this book?
Well, in a very similar way, the whole question of technology has always interested me um, in terms of my teaching, writing, etc. But I think I could pinpoint it in terms of being a professor at the University of Dallas in the late 70s and early 1980s.
Yeah.
Um, During the Reagan years, when the world was being wired for nuclear Armageddon. At one point, the doomsday clock of the atomic bulletin, atomic scientist, set it to 2 minutes to midnight. And I suddenly began to see in my patients, especially young people, a real sense of uh, hopelessness, undercurrent,
Mm-hmm.
real
Yeah.
sense of despair.
Worse. If we really let that reality in,
Yeah.
it's a wonder that we don't go screaming down the street, the world is coming to an end.
Well, yeah, and it's gotten worse.
Yeah.
So that prompted me to write an earlier version of the Frankenstein book, a much more technical, academic tone called Technology as Symptom and Dream, where I
Mm.
traced out the origins of the modern technological worldview to the 15th century invention of linear perspective art. And the three things, not to make it complicated more than it needs to be, that that book pointed out was that beginning somewhere in the late 15th century, we began to imagine ourselves as spectators looking at the world from behind a window. And that
Mm-hmm.
window turned out to be a gridded screen. And so we were spectators who had now distanced ourselves from nature and looking then at the world as a specimen for our observation, calculation, measurement, and the body, or the world as a spectacle and the body as a specimen. So those
Yes.
codes told that story. And I was totally surprised, Dave, that that book, which took me about 5 years to write, went through 5 or 6 different printings and is still in print. Because it's
Huh.
not an easy book to read. But now, as the world has gotten worse, I wanted to tell that story, but in a way that would reach a larger audience.
Something I discovered as I started your book was that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein story uh, has been the source of a lot of attention and critical commentary, and as a metaphor for a wide variety of things and authors. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting in the way that for 200 years it was published in 1818, um, and for 200 years it has endured, and increasingly so in modern times or more contemporary times. It is being seen as a parable for the kind of times in which we live,
Yeah.
a parable for our times about the lethal nature of denial of our responsibilities for what we are creating with our technological powers.
Right, right. That makes sense to me. Now, I know that I read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley years ago. I
Yeah,
don't know how many years ago, but a long time ago. And of course, we're many of us are brainwashed by the movies that we've seen, and which are can be some distance between the book that she wrote. Is it possible for you to give us? There'll be people in our audience who perhaps have not read the book. Is I know we're going to get into it more deeply. Is there a way to give us a little bit of an overview of the
sure.
story?
Well, the story originates when Mary Shelley and her husband, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Lord Byron and Lord Byron's physician are vacationing uh, in a house, I think it's Lake Geneva in Switzerland.
Wow.
And the weather that year was extremely bad because of a volcanic eruption earlier. I forget where it was. So they were forced to be indoors a lot. And one night, sitting around talking, I guess around a fire, somebody, we don't know who, proposed that each of them that evening write a ghost story, because
Hmm.
that was fascinating people.
Yeah.
Vampires, ghosts, the possibility of using electrical stimulation to resurrect the dead. And so they did. We don't know what the others wrote. There's no record of that as far as I know. We know that the physician of Lord Byron, I think his name was Poldari, wrote a vampire story. But Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. And it's based on a dream as she begins it. And that becomes very important later on when we talk about the role of dreams in the creation of that story.
Yeah.
So to give a summary, she writes the story, sends it to a publisher. The publisher says, this is impossible for a young woman to write. She's 18 years old. So her name doesn't appear on the first edition.
Oh my goodness.
Books of the Feminine, which runs through that story, their sacrifice, in fact. Eventually, it is published under her name, and it unfolds as a series of letters. It's in 3 parts, and the letters are written by a Captain John Walton, who was trying to find a Northwest Passage that was important at that time to try and find a way of connecting the 2 parts of the Atlantic and the Pacific. And on his voyage, he writes letters home to his sister in London. And those letters are the basis of the story, because at one point, as he's in the freezing Arctic waters, he sees a man in the distance in a boat. And it turns out to be Victor Frankenstein, who has tracked his creation, whom he calls a monster, to the Arctic in order to kill him. But Victor Frankenstein now is dying, and so Captain Walton and his crew rescue him, and they tell the story of Victor Frankenstein's work, which Captain Walton writes in letters back to his sister. Now, the main characters for our audience, and for those who have read but may have forgotten, are, of course, Victor Frankenstein, who is, I could say more about him later, his wife-to-be, Elizabeth Lavenza, she's important in the tale later on as we'll get to it. His good friend and colleague, Henry Purcell, he figures somewhat. His younger brother, William, and the people that he studies with at Ingolstadt University. So we'll get into that in more detail as well. But the key theme is that it is the death of Victor Frankenstein's mother when he's 15 years old, which horrifies him. He's bereft with loss. But in Mary Shelley's story, it turns out that instead of giving time to grieve and get into his feelings, he commits himself to conquering death, to ridding human life from the stain of death.
Uh-huh.
That's how the story is generated and how he begins his studies and the track that he follows. And that we'll get into that in each of the questions.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's probably, yeah, that gives us enough of a frame for it, I think, to get started. Your book is written in an interesting way, and it's organized around 8 questions. And so I thought that we would step through each of those questions and have a bit of a discussion. You can rhapsodize. I will make comments maybe as we go along. And so, and we may not have time to get through all 8 here. And in that case, people will just have to buy your book, you know. Hopefully they'll be in such suspense and such awe that they will realize that they must have this book. So particularly to understand, to have a context for the times that we are in, and to think about it more deeply. So the first question that you ask is whether or not this story by Mary Shelley is in fact a prophecy of the dangers of acting as gods. Now, just from what you've told us, Victor Frankenstein is taking on kind of, he's usurping the power of God because he's going to create a human being from dead body parts, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, and so get us into that.
Okay, if I may, I need to say how the book was written before I answer the question specifically, and why I use the question format. What I'm trying to do is to invite the reader into a different way of reading and thinking about our current contemporary technological issues.
Yeah.
So it is closer to the therapy room, and that's my background. You know, I've worked many years as a therapist, and when you're dealing with that one-on-one situation, what you are doing is you're not laying out a linear argument, but you are working through images. And that's what the questions are designed to do, to look at the events that we're living through today. For example, the use of the internet, and to look at it as if it was a shared cultural historical dream, and to look at these events as images. And
okay.
That's strictly out of a Jungian point of view, because the psyche works through images. The
Yes.
mind works through facts and reasons. So those questions, and that means that you have to enter into it in a way where you can allow yourself to be questioned by the events as they are being told.
Right. Yes.
So the first question then is Mary Shelley's story a prophecy of the dangers of us acting as if we are gods? Well, Victor Frankenstein turns out in the story to be a prototype, or even an archetypal figure, of what it means to anoint oneself with the powers of science and technology to begin a new creation. And that's what he's going to do. He is going to erase what he calls the stain of death from human life by using the powers of science and technology, which in his time was the marvel of electricity, and the way electricity could be used to animate dead flesh. It was all the rage in the early part of the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
It started with frog legs, and you could take an electric current, stimulate dead tissue, and it would jump. And so they thought, oh, electricity must be the source of life. You know, and Victor Frankenstein says, if I could harness that power, then I could go and get dead material that I dig up in cemeteries and literally resurrect the dead.
Yeah. And the frog leg, the twitching frog leg, is kind of a classic demonstration, I think, in high school biology courses.
It still is.
Yeah, still is.
we've advanced enough to know that that's a reflex action of nerves
Right.
stimulated by electricity. Today, though we're in the same dream, but instead of using electricity, we're using, we'll get to this, genetic advances married to our technological advances to really carry out Frankenstein's dream. So it's the same dream on an archetypal level, but with different means.
And speaking of the archetypal level, I know you talk about the modern Prometheus. Was that a subtitle that Mary Shelley used?
Oh, that's a good question. Thank you for reminding me of that. Her story was originally titled Frankenstein, semicolon, or, comma, the modern Prometheus. And the way that it's punctuated there suggests that she's not making an analogy, she's making a stronger claim that the mythic Prometheus is now realized in the figure of Victor Frankenstein. He is the modern Prometheus. And when you know that myth of Prometheus, you know that he transcended the boundary between humans and the gods by stealing fire from the gods to serve humankind.
Right.
That he himself, he alone was punished. Well, Victor Frankenstein doesn't just cross that boundary, he erases it. He becomes the new god. So he lives out that myth, but in modern terms, and many other people suffer because of his pride. Not just him, but many other people, because he denies responsibility for what he has done. So there is this mythic link, which he now lives out in modern form.
Yes, yes. And so, of course, we are the technological edge. One of the technological edges these days is, in fact, questioning, is death necessary? Can we engineer death out of the picture, except through accidental death? But, there are people who are on the cutting edge of saying that, hey, we can live a lot, we can extend our life span by quite a bit.
Yeah.
That death is almost like a disease.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, that is the whole thread throughout the book, the modern ways in which we are taking up his story to be the death of death. We're going to be the ones who slay death.
Yeah.
And that's an old, ancient, archetypal theme, but there have always been boundaries around it. And now, because we have the powers of genetics and technology, through the Frankenstein story, we see that acting as if we are gods, there's something shadowy about that God complex in the human being, where there are no boundaries.
Yeah. When I think about the story of technology in our time and going back, it seems to me it's a story of unexpected consequences.
Mm.
We have these beautiful dreams of, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could, without really understanding what are going to be the unexpected consequences as it goes forward. Yeah. And are there unexpected consequences for Victor Frankenstein in this story?
Well, the unattended consequences begin almost immediately, and it runs throughout the novel. That's why her story is a cautionary parable for our time, a warning, because the death that he would erase from life comes back to haunt him all over the place. And when I look at the prophecies, the way that's expressed today, death is all around us. Think about the powers we have used in genocidal wars, the powers of atomic bombing, the death of nature, the death that we would erase from life becomes a shadow that has grown and haunts us with its terrible consequences. So yes, he does suffer unintended consequences, and it begins right after he thinks he has failed. And then one night he hears a stirring in his laboratory, and he goes down and the creature opens, and the description of that in Mary Shelley's story is unbelievable. It goes something like, and he saw him open one pale yellow eye. And he goes on to describe, oh my God, what have I done? Because they made him of gigantic size.
Yeah.
Another parable for our time. Look at the way we're into gigantism. Big corporations, big pharma, big everything, supersized.
Right, right. Amazon. Facebook. Huge. Facebook could be a country, you know?
And they fast are becoming a country.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he's horrified, and his comment is, oh my God, I wanted to make something beautiful. And so he fails because his idea of beauty is not realized. And he runs away and he falls into sleep, and he has this horrific nightmare, which in the beginning of her story is like the dream saying, this is what's waiting for you, Victor Frankenstein.
Oh.
Death. It's chilling.
Yeah.
That's the way I try. I try to every chapter takes pieces of Mary Shelley's story and then ties it into looking at the consequences of it today, the unintended consequences, looking at these events, not in a causal way, but as images in a dream, because we're enmeshed in a dream. And when you're dreaming, you don't know you're in a dream. And that's why people are trying to wake up.
Yeah, yeah, okay. So maybe we can move on to question 2 then, which is Mary Shelley's story a prophecy of the dying of nature? And, you know, and you structure the book as prophecies. So this is a good question to be asking. I mean, you know, was Mary Shelley tapping into something in the deep unconscious? One has to wonder, because it does seem prophetic.
Yeah, but you have to, you know, that's why I say it's closer to like working with dreams in therapy. You have to listen to what's on the margins. You know, so when a patient comes in and tells you something about a dream, you're listening into how that dream is expressing something to the conscious waking life of the person that has been exiled to the margins. And the whole
That's it. You use that term throughout the book. You're talking about the margins. And so anything else that you can say to help clarify that idea? You're listening to the patients telling the dream.
Yeah.
And what's going on inside you in terms of those margins? What are the margins? Can you give us an example, maybe?
Yeah, I can give you an example. A margin exists when what we feel within ourselves, whether it's expressed as a dream, which is very powerful, or expressed as a feeling that erupts, and we say, well, that's not me, you know? I have a dream image. I wake up, it's a nightmare, and it's where maybe I see myself doing a horrific act of violence. And in my waking life, that's not who I am. So I push it away. That's called denial. That's a basic psychological defense mechanism that falls into the unconscious. So we deny what's horrible in ourselves, but that's not enough. Then we have to project it outside. And so others then carry what is horrific in me. And I begin to see them as the enemy, as the other, as the demon, as the devil. And so now we begin to deny what's in ourselves, project it onto others, and then we begin to build a wall within ourselves and a wall outside. So whatever is on the other side of the wall lives out in a demonized, exiled, marginal way. And that's Victor Frankenstein's monster.
Yeah.
So I tell her story from his point of view. And let me give you another concrete example. Look at the walls we're building down in our southern border.
Yeah.
You know, so without getting political here, they are demonized as racist, drug smugglers, whatever. and they're on the inside of the wall, and we're going to build the wall to keep them out. But that wall is also a wall within ourselves.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and it allows us to place the stain on them, so to speak.
Yeah.
I don't have the stain; they've got the stain, and we've got to keep them out.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the question too was: is Mary Shelley's story a prophecy of the dying of nature? So let's focus on nature a bit with the.
Yeah.
We have whales washing up on the shores of California.
Yeah, I saw that the other day. My wife and I taking a walk on the beach. We saw this beautiful adult seal. I don't know if it was a male or a female. And it was struggling and it was disoriented. It didn't know to turn toward the water or come to the land.
Mm.
All of these kinds of head movements as if it gave the impression, because we're emotionally touched by such things, that he's disoriented. And I called animal services, and the park ranger came, and he said they're beaching up all over California because the water has become too acidic. You know, and at some place we have to ask ourselves, is this a piece of insanity? How could we have built a world that is killing the life around us? Are we so distant from nature that we've lost any kind of empathy for how we share life with every living thing on the planet?
Yeah.
So it's all around us. But to see how it's a prophecy in Mary Shelley, I had to link it to something in her novel. And you see that in the way that Victor Frankenstein looks at churchyard graveyards. That's where he's going to get the raw material to build his new race of beings that would never know death. But what I do then in the book is he looks at those who are buried in sacred ground, churchyard cemeteries, where we have rituals of mourning and memory. And he says, there are only dead bodies for worms here. So he's already changed his attitude toward nature. It's not something sacred anymore. It's not the place where community gathers to say goodbye in rituals of loss and mourning and memory.
Mm-hmm.
Memory is born at the side of the grave where we promise to remember who was. It's now simply a resource for our use and, as it turns out, for our abuse.
Yeah.
So we see that prophecy expressing itself today in this attitude toward nature as simply a resource for us to do what we want.
Right.
And I tie it to some of the horrific events like what happened in Port Arthur, Texas 2 years ago with the hurricane and the oil spills and the acidification of oceans and the dying, the melting of the polar ice. And it's all
There's so many examples that one can point to that just that fact alone is alarming.
Yeah.
It's not just one thing. We're seeing it throughout the system.
Yeah.
And systems within systems that are telling us that we're off course. You borrowed a phrase from Francis Bacon that I thought was powerful. Nature on the rack.
Yeah.
So even back in his time, he was seeing that beginning to emerge.
Well, Francis Bacon, it's not really known for sure whether he said that, but the spirit of what's in those words was meant. And he's one of the early scientists, because in the 16th century, we're amazed at the powers that science can give us, and rightly so. I mean, we cannot disinvent technology. We got to find a way to be in relationship with it. But Francis Bacon, a quote attributed, and it's in the spirit of his work, let's put nature on the rack and torture from her secrets. So there's already an identification of nature as feminine. So when you're using nature, and this runs through Mary Shelley's story too, you are also sacrificing the feminine. And that's happening. Look at the Me Too movement and everything from the margins that rising up, the way women have been used only in service of the patriarchy. So again, I'm
Yeah.
pointing to a link as if we are living in a dream. And um, again, I would like to say that I'm trying to tell this as a story because facts alone are not going to change us. We look around at all of these horrific things. I'm trying to give you a story because in my life as a therapist, that's what changes people, to see the story they're embedded in, to become more conscious and aware of it, and to know that that story has been around and it's not just about them, but it's a story that we're swimming in.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Um, well, let's move on to question 3. Is Mary Shelley's story a prophecy of the monster's descendants? Where is that in the story?
Well, this is really a key because when Victor Frankenstein abandons his creature, and he never names him, he just runs away and faints initially, and then he refuses to take any responsibility for what the monster has done, uh, some of the deaths that are attributed to him. Um,
The monster turns on him. Doesn't the monster begin to hate him?
well, that's the way it's been told from Victor Frankenstein's point of view, as if he's blameless. So I'm trying to tell the story from his point of view, and this is the question about his descendants. When he realizes that there is no one in the world who looks like him, of such gigantic stature, scarred, disfigured, every time he meets somebody, they run away. And finally, he learns to educate himself when he hides out outside the home of a family called the DeLacy's and learns their language. And then he has some hope that maybe he is not just going to be the first of his kind or the last. So he then begs Victor Frankenstein, make me a mate so that I will not be so lonely. And here's where Mary Shelley's story is a retelling of the Western story of creation, where Adam has his partner, Eve. So he's saying even Adam had his Eve, assuage my loneliness. And Victor Frankenstein refuses. And so he then says in the story, I will seek my vengeance then on you. And not only will I suffer, but you will suffer too. So I'm trying to open up a place of understanding how abandonment by his creator turns him into what he is. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah,
We oftentimes do that when we refuse to take responsibility for the messes we have made, and then we blame it on the other person. It's their fault, whether it be colleagues, whether it be a marriage, whether it be corporations, whatever the case may be. So he then begs Victor, make me a mate. And Victor says, no, I won't do it because then you will propagate and you will be the curse of humankind. And he says, I promise we will go to the farthest reaches of the world. In those days, it was in the Arctic region, in the poles. And we will live as one, but we will never propagate. So Victor Frankenstein agrees. And then he goes to Scotland to do a second creation, to create a mate for his monster. And in Moonlight, and there's a big contrast between Moonlight, which is feminine, and the solar light of Victor's mind, which is patriarchal.
yes.
He suddenly sees through the window moonlight shining on the mate he's making as the monster standing outside, hopeful for the first time that he will no longer have to be enraged, but can go away and be in sympathy with another person who is like him. Victor Frankenstein tears her to pieces, limb from limb, throws her in the dark waters of the Scottish lakes, And that where the story turns pivotal, because the creature says to him, "You will suffer as I have. I will be with you on your wedding night." And Victor Frankenstein is so narcissistic, he thinks it's about him. The monster's going to kill him. But the monster comes and kills Elizabeth Lavenza. Do we understand that? I'm trying to say yes, if you see how he has been made into the creature he is. But that's all that we see in the movies. Remember Boris Karloff? He's a dumb, mute, destructive being. But there's another story in there which gets to the untapped, unconscious roots that are in all of us. And so the fundamental question 7, I think, is who is the monster? And unless we get in touch with the monsters within, we're going to keep building walls and marginalizing people, whether they're blacks, whether they're Jews, whether they're Palestinians, whether they're Mexicans.
Yeah.
We repeat the same cycle over and over and over again. We need a new kind of ethics.
Yeah. Now, this question that we're looking at is talking about the monster's descendants. Yeah. And that brings me back to maybe the monster's descendants are the unexpected consequences of our actions.
Yeah, I missed the point of that. I got carried away, but you could see I'm passionate about this. But his descendants, so Victor Frankenstein says, I will not create you, mate. He tears it to pieces. The story ends in the Arctic. It's finished there, but it doesn't end. And I'm trying to continue the story today. And you don't know if the monster really dies. And I'm saying now, if you look at contemporary events, he has 2 lines of descendants. One is the dream of Victor Frankenstein to erase death from the body. And we see this now, as you pointed out before, in terms of people who say, we're going to get rid of death. We're continuing that line. So we see that line that is the line of a descendant that realizes Victor Frankenstein's side of the story. But then we see the shadow side, the other descendants, the ones who live on the margins, and we meet them in the guise of our symptoms. The war veteran on the street, the bag lady, the homeless person, the way in which all of them have been exiled because we'd rather not see them.
Yeah.
You know? And
yeah.
I look at contemporary events, and I ask people to look at it. My point is not to say, well, my point is simple. We have to wake up to our own participation in the kind of culture we've made. Because if we don't know the story where we've come from, we don't know where we are, and we don't know where we're going.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're going to head toward disaster.
Yeah, because these prophecies that you're raising, they're all sort of warnings about where we are headed.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
I'm looking at question 4 now. Is Mary Shelley's story a prophecy of creating a new species of humankind?
Yeah.
And if I start to associate to that, maybe the new humankind is one that's less sensitive, more objectifying. Less sensitive to the deeper aspects of life and being, in the social context that we're in.
So there is when we talk about the dying of nature and Victor Franken's attitude towards nature from behind a window, we've lost aesthetic sensibility. And aesthetics means to be touched by something, to feel something. So we're no longer resonate. Like when I saw that seal, it brought me to tears because I could feel in empathy the suffering of that creature.
Mm-hmm.
So when we've lost that capacity, we're on the way towards creating the kind of being you're describing. But when I'm talking about the monster's descendants, questions 4 and 5 go together. The one thing that stands in the way of really realizing Victor Frankenstein's dream to rid life of the stain of death, it's this. Our bodies are memento moris. to be embodied in this lovely way in which we smell and taste and feel the world and are touched by the world, that's the obstacle, because the body dies. And so to get rid of death, you have to engineer new species that eventually will leave the body behind.
Right, right. Later you get into Ray Kurzweil, who actually, if I recall correctly, I saw a video of some sort of about Ray Kurzweil, and I believe his whole thing about the singularity,
Yeah,
his notion that we are headed in a direction with our technology that will ultimately perhaps free us from death as machines take over, as we become more machine-like, as we become part machine ourselves as cyborgs.
mm.
And I believe that the death of his father
Mm.
was a strongly motivating force. It's just like in the Frankenstein story.
The death of his mother. Yeah.
Yeah, the death of his mother. Now here's Kurzweil, the death of his father, whom he worshipped, and he wants to restore.
Yeah.
And get the brain in a bottle and get it hooked up to enough things, and you've got your father back.
Yeah, but is that your father really?
Right,
So what
because
I
you're missing, as you were just pointing out when you talked about memento mori,
yeah.
that the flesh is such an important part of
Mm.
it all.
Yeah, it connects us to others, to community, to nature. The poets have always fascinated me, and a lot of my psychology has been through the poets. The poet Rilke, in his Duino Elegy, says, "We are neither angels nor beasts." And his elegies begin with, "Oh, gee, if only we were angels, or beasts who never know mortality, and angels who are not even aware of that." But then by the end, his elegy is a song of praise that, not being an angel or a beast, we know the human world and the beauties of it. And because we are embodied creatures. So this whole struggle with death is a struggle that has to do away with the body. And so it's so opposite of what the poet is addressing. Remember the flesh, remember being embodied. So I would just say that what I try to trace out in questions 4 and 5 are the steps from the astronaut, because the astronaut, now I'm not opposed to space flight. Again, I'm not saying that we should become Luddites and smash the machines and do away with technology. First of all, that's impossible. You can't disinvent what you've already created. But I'm worried about the unquestioned embrace of technology that doesn't take time to step back about the consequences.
Yeah.
And in questions 4 and 5, I talk about the astronaut being modeled on the same kind of specimen body that Victor Frankenstein used. So they're wonderful things in space flight, but there is already a body that is built to live on the moon or in space. You cannot take your mask off. When you're in the space station, you can, but you're still, if you go outside, it's lights out. And then
It's considered a skin, right? That suit is considered a skin. It's a different skin.
Yeah. And it's a skin that translates human activities like breathing into a technical function, which is a good thing to know, or translates the heart into the specimen body that began in the 15th century. I traced that out. Is the heart a pump? Well, yes. And if I get a pain in my chest, I don't want somebody who loves me to read poetry to me, because the heart is also an organ of love and communication. But when I'm like that, I want to see a doctor. But if I am enthusiastic about something and I feel it in my heart, then that heart is a pump is lived out in a different way. It's lived out as love and affection and memory. The word heart means memory and courage. To have heart is to remember who you are. To have heart is to have courage to be who you are. Language has consequences.
Yeah.
So I trace out other descendants from Homo astronauticus to what we're doing right now, Homo digitalis. You know, I love the fact that we could do this, but we're not embodied. And so I do a whole thing on what it means to live in digital space. I'm glad that we can. I can see my grandson, but we're not flesh. Nobody catches a cold in digital space. Nobody can kiss the other in digital space. So how do we use this technology in a way that doesn't forget who we are? Embodied, fleshy beings.
Yeah.
And then we go to Kurzweil, who eventually says, we will transcend biology. When the singularity happens, and he predicts it could be as soon as 2045, we'll be able to download what makes us most human, our intelligence, into the cloud. So we become what I call Homo Deus, you know, or Homo Spiritus.
Yeah.
And we're all on the way. Cyborgs, the technologies that we use. I mean, take this. Have you ever tried to throw your cell phone away for one day? We're already hooked in.
Oh yeah, no, I've got one too. Totally. I talk about it as a prosthesis for my brain,
Yeah.
which unfortunately emphasizes your point. But I really, you know, I say it somewhat jokingly, but it's true because there are all these things I can't remember that are on the tip of my tongue. Oh, what's the name of that movie? Let's see, who was in it? You know, and I'll be able to use it in that way. So there's a way in which it's quite miraculous, but at the same time, we are reshaping ourselves to interface with the tools because we don't naturally interface with them, although they're getting more and more, making it more convenient, more easy for us to interface with them. But, you know, you have to learn how to talk to your computer. You have to learn how, you can't just type in anything. You've got to type in something that's very specific that it's going to understand and in certain ways. If it's not entered in the correct order, it totally doesn't work. I'm thinking of programming and what it's like to do programming, where you have to learn a very specific language.
Yes. Yeah.
And we bend our lives. The tools are reshaping our lives and our relationships.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I've also been trained in philosophy, and the German philosopher Martin Heidegger put this point that you made very nicely. He's talking about a hammer, and he said, if a hammer is the only tool you have in the toolbox, everything you come across is a nail. You know,
yeah, I've heard that a lot. I had no idea it went back to Heidegger.
Yeah. So it's a nail, and then the tools use us rather than us using the tool. And that's all I'm trying to do in this book. Again, it's sort of like a cultural form of psychotherapy, because we're in perilous times, and that's what fuels my passion here.
Yes.
You know, if we don't stop and get a different kind of ethical relationship to our powers, which takes responsibility for what their consequences can be. We're told, even about the environment, that in 20 years, the habit is going to become, Earth is going to become increasingly uninhabitable. And we're seeing that already.
Yes.
So it's a plea, a simple plea. Like when the alarm clock goes off, you wake up and you don't want to wake up. And I don't know. I don't want to sound like I'm superior because I use technology and I want us to be able to use technology, but we have to know what the shadows of it are.
Right, right. You know, that might be a good wrap up thing to say. I was going to invite you, you know, to say, well, You know, are there any last things you want to say? And since I put that on the table, I'll give you a chance to do that.
Well, I think the last two questions, the one we didn't get to, 6, is about how digital space is making us feel connected when we are in fact much more alone. So Sherry Turkle, an MIT psychologist, wrote a wonderful book, Alone Together. So I go into the drawbacks of digital space without damning it, still saying that it is important for us. But the book has to offer seeds of hope. And that's why there is question 7 and 8. And question 7 in this wrap up would be, face the question of our own monstrous capacities. Listen to what you are denying and projecting onto others. Integrate a little bit of the shadow that you can within your own life in ordinary ways. You see the homeless person on the street. There could be an act of redemption in that, not just to give them money, but to stop and talk with them, to bring them back into the human community. These little acts of resistance and rebellion are like ripples in the dream that might wake us up or change things. So on that question, I'm trying to sketch out an ethics that is built on the margins where we pay attention to our own monstrous capacities, which doesn't make us evil. It just makes us human. We're not all light, but we're not all darkness either. We got to hold that balance.
Yeah.
And to split, oh, I'm so good, let's make America great again, which means everybody else is less than us. We lose something of ourselves.
Right.
We do that. And then the last chapter was to offer other seeds of hope. And I think one of the major claims I'm making in the book is that if you read between the lines or listen to the way the monster interacts with his creator and the way that he imagines and hopes for a being like himself, it's a testimony of love that goes beyond power. And Victor Frankenstein's love is all about power and putting the others off until he finishes what he's doing. The monster is more of a creature who loves in a way that sees the other for what that other is, and not just for what they serve in him. So I make the claim that one of the seeds of hope in Mary Shelley's story is that if you read it from the monster's point of view, the so-called monster, that it's a tangled love story. And it teaches us how love many times gets corrupted by power. Those uncertain appeals, be for me what I can't be for myself, be my savior. I've seen that all the time in the therapy room. I've worked through it in my own life. Or we project onto our children, we love you so much, you're going to really do something fantastic. What a burden that is.
Right.
So love is a seed of hope. And then the other thing is, when I follow the trail of the monster, it opens up ways of getting back in touch with our relationship with nature. And I give some examples of the wondrous, miraculous beauty if you just stop and look at the epiphanies of nature. Simple things. The sound of birds in the morning, the way sunlight dapples the grass as it moves through the trees. I mean, this is more of a poetic realism in the world, a poetic way of being responsive to the world, which is a counterbalance to our empirical, fact-minded way, which we need.
Yeah.
But we've lost that the world is animate and alive and we're part of it. So it's a way to get back connected with that. That's another seed of hope, the stories I tell in question 8. And then finally, another seed of hope is one way to deal with the margins in ourselves and in the world is we have to realize the value and the wisdom of the dream. When Freud and Jung began their work, they were opening up the possibility of a radical change of what it means to be a human being. The dream, whatever it means, is an invitation into becoming the possibility of something that the dream represents. Can you be that? It's like education in the night theater of the soul. You know, when you go to the theater, you see the figures and the characters. I remember when I walked out of my first James Bond film, all the young men in the 60s walked out as if they were James Bond.
Yeah, right.
Well, you get figures in a dream. Think of it as going into the night theater of the deeper part of your mind. And then wake up and say, wow, that's an interesting possibility for me. How might I change if I tried to integrate that possibility? And the dream is important because it runs throughout Mary Shelley's story. It begins with a dream, and it runs throughout at key points when he has key dreams. So I'm hopeful because we don't even have time to be pessimistic. We all have to throw our little pebble to the ocean to see what it stirs up in each of us.
Yeah.
I thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my passion and what I've tried to do.
Yeah, well, I thank you for sharing it. Dr. Robert Romanyshyn, what a gift this has been, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.